Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. AMD are likely blocking competitor technology such as DLSS from their sponsored games. At least that's the only conclusion we can draw after discussions with them, if you can call it that, over the past week. This is a bad and unfair situation for gamers, and it also highlights yet another AMD PR blunder involving the Radeon division. We've got a fair few thoughts on the situation, so let's talk about it all after a word from today's video sponsor.
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Antec and their Performance One Full Tower eATX case. Designed to support the latest RTX 40 series graphics cards up to 400mm long, the P1 is big on the inside with loads of options for top and front mounted radiators, including the ability to support dual 360mm rads simultaneously. The P1 comes with 4 pre-installed Storm T3 PWM fans with the ability to expand fan support to additional 6. It also includes a temperature display, dual 4mm tempered glass side panels, cable management covers complete with Velcro straps for quick and easy cable management. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
For those out of the loop, here's a recap of the AMD blocking DLSS story so far. A couple of weeks ago, WCCF Tech published an article titled "What's Up with the Missing Nvidia DLSS Support in AMD-Sponsored FSR Titles?" And in this article, they looked at a list of games, noticing that more AMD-sponsored games didn't include DLSS than Nvidia-sponsored games didn't include FSR. They also reached out to both AMD and Nvidia for comment and received 2 starkly different responses. Nvidia said, "Nvidia does not and will not block, restrict, discourage or hinder developers from implementing competitor technologies in any way. We provide the support and tools for all game developers to easily integrate DLSS if they choose, and even created Nvidia Streamline to make it easier for game developers to add competitive technologies to their games." AMD said, in contrast, "To clarify, there are community sites that track the implementation of upscaling technologies, and these sites indicate that there are a number of games that support only DLSS currently. AMD Fidelity FX Super Resolution is an open source technology that supports a variety of GPU architectures, including consoles and competitive solutions, and we believe an open approach that is broadly supported on multiple hardware platforms is the best approach that benefits developers and gamers. AMD is committed to doing what is best for game developers and gamers, and we give developers the flexibility to implement FSR into whichever games they choose." The significant differences in these statements, plus the trend of feature support seen in games, led many people to conclude that AMD is using language in their sponsorship contracts to block DLSS from those games. We talked about this in a recent Q&A episode, and while we didn't feel at the time the evidence was strong enough to definitively say DLSS was being blocked in these contracts, we did agree there could be some persuasion going on behind the scenes, and that the entire situation is unacceptable garbage. After we filmed that Q&A segment, AMD and Bethesda/Microsoft announced that Starfield would be an AMD-sponsored title, and that's when things really started to heat up again. A lot of people took this and previous trends to mean that Starfield would only integrate AMD's FSR2 technology and not DLSS or Intel's XeSS. When Gamers Nexus asked AMD about the situation, AMD responded with, "We have no comment at this time," a rather telling statement. You'd think, based on AMD's lack of comment and unwillingness to clarify the situation, that indeed Starfield would only include FSR and not DLSS, although we won't know for sure until the game launches. Over the past week, we've been investigating the situation to try and find a definitive answer for you. We've copped a little bit of flack on places like Reddit for wanting actual information before claiming something dodgy is happening, so let's see what we've found. It's safe to say at this point that AMD's response has been completely inadequate and basically a PR disaster for the company. But first, let's look at the trend in games with the full comprehensive list of sponsored titles. We'll start with Nvidia's sponsored games. A couple of things about this list first. To qualify as a sponsored game, it must either appear on the respective company's website, both maintain a list of featured games, or have an obvious sponsored splash screen, or be used heavily in marketing materials. The list is split into 2 halves, the left half being games in the FSR2 era, so released after AMD released FSR2 in the middle of 2022, and the right half being the FSR1 era, so released after FSR1 in the middle of 2021 but before FSR2. Nvidia sponsors a lot more games than AMD, so the list is quite a bit larger for Nvidia. What we can see is that across the last year, the FSR2 era, More Nvidia-sponsored games have launched with FSR2 than not. This is true for 9 of the 17 games. A further 4 did include an AMD upscaling option at launch, that being FSR1, 3 of which have since been updated to FSR2. Returnal took 2 months, Atomic Heart 4 months, and F122 took 6 months, although the game was released close to the launch of FSR2. 4 games have not received FSR upscaling support, so that's 53% of games with FSR2 at launch and 76% with FSR of some kind at launch across the past year's releases. In the FSR1 era, just under half of Nvidia's sponsored games did include FSR upscaling at launch, although Forza Horizon 5 technically didn't have either FSR or DLSS upscaling at launch, but did introduce both in the same update. One title took 18 months to integrate FSR, while 4 of the games were updated to include FSR2, despite launching before the tech was available. 8 titles released in this era have no FSR support of any kind. So in total, across the 33 Nvidia-sponsored games since the launch of FSR1, 20 of those games had some form of FSR for as long as DLSS has been in the game, and 21 of those games have both FSR and DLSS today, 17 with FSR2. That's around 2/3 of all Nvidia titles with cross-platform upscaling support. On the AMD side, it's bleak. For a start, AMD sponsors far fewer games than Nvidia, just 11 in the FSR2 era and 9 in the FSR1 era for a total of 20 games. And across these games, there is poor support for DLSS. Of games released in the past year, including 2 early access titles which are featured on AMD's website, DLSS is in just 3 of them. That's a pathetic 27% of titles with cross-platform support. It also includes the game Boundary, which actually removed DLSS support from the game after receiving AMD sponsorship in favor of FSR2 and XeSS. The developers claimed this was because they can't support multiple technical features, but that answer is quite suspicious given they are supporting XeSS that is usable on way less than 1% of all GPUs rather than DLSS. In the FSR1 era, it's even more dire. For a start, it turns out most FSR1 games were older titles released before FSR1 that were updated to include FSR1 support. Just one of those titles was updated at the same time to include DLSS, that being Horizon Zero Dawn. 5 other titles were updated with FSR1 or 2, but did not include DLSS in that update or any subsequent update. 2 other AMD-sponsored titles released during the FSR1 era only included FSR, while the other, Deathloop, was patched 1 month after launch to include DLSS, while also including FSR at launch. Across AMD-sponsored games, just 5 of the 20 include DLSS, 4 of which had DLSS for as long as FSR. So while 2/3 of Nvidia's games do include some form of AMD upscaling, only 25% of AMD's games include Nvidia's DLSS upscaling. So that's a pretty stark discrepancy. What makes drawing firm conclusions from this alone difficult is that it doesn't appear as though restricting DLSS from AMD-sponsored titles is a blanket policy that applies to all sponsorships. 5 AMD-sponsored games do have DLSS support. Similarly, you could argue that not all Nvidia games include FSR, although I think it's much harder to make that point when an overwhelming majority of recent releases include FSR, and Nvidia's statement on the matter is pretty definitive. But I think it's a pretty clear trend when you see 25% of AMD's games with DLSS, but 63% of Nvidia games with FSR over a 2-year period. Some people have explained the inclusion of DLSS in some AMD-sponsored games as those games being Sony exclusive titles. There certainly seems to be some merit to that argument, but it's hard to know for sure without knowing what's sort of happening behind the scenes. Anyway, it's not really the games list that I think paints the most definitive picture. It's been AMD's atrocious handling of this situation and their refusal to answer any specific questions around game sponsorship. As I mentioned earlier, AMD provided a no comment to Gamers Nexus when asked about Starfield specifically, but it gets worse than that because I asked some much more broad questions than even that, and even then, AMD weren't willing to answer. So here's the story. After seeing the Starfield sponsorship announcement, I reached out to AMD and asked them 2 fairly basic questions. When a partnership agreement is signed, does AMD block or restrict game developers from integrating technology from their competitors, such as Nvidia with DLSS? And secondly, does AMD want to clarify the statement they made in the WCCF Tech article, especially after seeing Nvidia's definitive statement? I asked both of these questions on Wednesday of last week, and I'm currently filming this video on Tuesday. So I've had a few conversations with our local AMD representative via phone since then, and even today, the response from AMD is that they are still deciding on a response. Not a reply to my questions, not even a no comment. It's more of a, we don't know what to say yet. That's a pathetic response, and it's quite revealing, and it's also disastrous PR from AMD. If AMD were doing the right thing and not restricting developers from using DLSS, the answer is relatively straightforward. No, we don't restrict developers. You'd give the same answer as Nvidia did when they were asked. It doesn't take days to formulate an answer. You don't need to check with game partners whether you're happy to say that. You just say, nope, we haven't done that. But I think what makes this particularly bad is that AMD weren't even willing to clarify their statement made to WCCF Tech. That is a very open-ended invitation. They really could have said anything to try and save face here, but they've chosen not to. So at this point, the only conclusion I can draw is that AMD are unwilling to clarify what's going on, and in the event they weren't pulling a dodgy, they don't want to correct the community on any misconceptions that may have been drawn from that article and statement. And I was willing to give AMD some benefit of the doubt here. Often when you ask companies a question, they will come back with a PR response that kind of dodges the specifics of the question, but will talk up their features and how good they are. One possible explanation is when WCCF Tech asked AMD, they decided to respond with one of these PR responses, rather than a direct answer. Then Nvidia gets asked, they respond more directly, AMD looks silly in comparison, and inferences are drawn. That's the benefit of the doubt explanation, but that benefit only extends up to asking if AMD wants to be more specific and clarify the situation after seeing how Nvidia handled it. They haven't been able to come up with anything in nearly a week. With no response from AMD to any of our questions, no one from AMD as yet willing to appear on Hardware Unboxed to explain what is going on. I also asked them if they wanted to do that. Their response to Gamers Nexus, no clarifications being made to previous statements, the trend of game support for FSR and DLSS. The final conclusion we've drawn is that AMD likely are restricting competitor technology in games they have sponsored. I'd say this is very likely something AMD are currently doing or have done in the past or both, and it doesn't bode well for future releases like Starfield. Steve from GN made a good point that with AMD refusing to comment at the moment, there is a chance they can or will attempt to save face by going back and amending their agreements to allow DLSS in these games. They could come out and say, hey look, we never did anything dodgy. That would be a good outcome for gamers, but I wouldn't buy a message that they have never restricted their competitors. It's too late for that. Obviously, this is a bad situation for gamers. Restricting competitive technology in games is anti-consumer and it's just pathetic behavior. A winning strategy is always to make better products, convince buyers they are better, and then put it up for fair evaluation on its merits. Going the dodgy route and placing restrictions instead is garbage, and it won't endear buyers to your company. Those that play dirty get bad reputations, and that does have an impact on business. Gamers then get screwed over in the process, wanting to play games using the best available technology that their GPU supports. And I don't buy the argument that developers will choose to only integrate FSR2 in their games because it's open and works across all GPUs, thus making DLSS integration unnecessary. For a start, many of the titles that have FSR but don't have DLSS are built in Unreal Engine, an engine which is extremely easy to integrate both FSR and DLSS into, either via a simple plugin or effective checkbox in the game engine. Both AMD and Nvidia have stated multiple times that once you integrate one of these technologies, it's easy to integrate the rest. They've really tried to make it as simple as possible, and yeah, there might be some QA cost associated with making sure it works, but for a major game like Jedi Survivor, published by EA and developed by Respawn using Unreal Engine 4, they definitely have the resources to make it work. We also haven't seen any evidence of developers producing games with no sponsorship choosing to integrate FSR to support all GPUs and then not supporting DLSS. There are many examples of games this year that include a wide variety of upscaling technologies that haven't been sponsored by either AMD or Nvidia. Hogwarts Legacy, Dead Space, F123, Hi-Fi Rush, Gotham Knights are just some of the major neutral games released in the last year that have chosen to integrate FSR and DLSS. There are very few, if any, of these neutral games choosing only FSR. The final point I want to make is that AMD has badly botched the PR and messaging around this. I really don't know what they are thinking here, but whatever it isn't good. If they truly aren't blocking competitor tech in their sponsorship agreements, the obvious move is to get on the front foot and clarify what is being said. Waiting around for days to make any sort of comment is just fueling the fire. Every day without comment leads people more towards believing something dodgy is going on. And if something dodgy was going on, if there are restrictive terms in their agreements, did AMD really think people would never realize this? And if they did think people would find out, why didn't they have some sort of message prepared for the obvious questions that will come about? Like, just think about it for a second. If they keep restricting DLSS from their games, eventually it comes to the point where people notice the last 5, 10, 15 games with the AMD logo on it have FSR but not DLSS. That's basically where we are today, but it could continue further with more games added to the list. Eventually gamers are going to go, what on earth is happening here? Complain about it and ask the question to AMD. But apparently in this situation, AMD hasn't even thought about what to say and how to deal with the fallout when those questions come. This is just yet another PR blunder from AMD, and there is a trend of this happening with their Radeon division. Just a couple of months ago, they botched the launch of the RX 7600 and angered reviewers with a last-minute price change that A, they didn't communicate properly to all reviewers, and B, didn't really change conclusions in any substantial way. Prior to that, they didn't even think that the $900 MSRP of the RX 7900 XT would lead to widespread negative reviews, as the price-to-performance ratio was worse than the more expensive XTX model. As far as we understand, they believed that was a good price and were expecting a lot of sales. Those are just some of the blunders in the last year. There have been other issues, like AMD not releasing RX 6000 series drivers for months, attempting to not support new Zen CPUs on 400 series motherboards, boasting about the VRAM capacity of their GPUs, then launching a brand new 8GB GPU in 2023. I guess the list goes on. So here is where things stand. AMD are likely blocking competitive technologies from games they sponsor, and our opinion on that won't change until we see compelling evidence otherwise, like a definitive, believable statement from AMD that explains the situation. This is a garbage anti-consumer move that hurts gamers, and the current pushback over the situation will hopefully lead to change, similar to the current anger over GPU prices. AMD needs to immediately clarify the situation, or if they are blocking competitive technologies, which is more likely, they need to end that practice and amend any agreements they have entered into. Games that are actively receiving updates like Jedi Survivor and the Callisto Protocol with its recent DLC should be allowed to integrate DLSS, as should Starfield and any future games. AMD also need to improve their PR. This sort of thing is a disaster for the company and hurts their position in the GPU market, where they have poor market share relative to Nvidia. Gamers don't like this crap, and they certainly aren't going to buy an AMD GPU because only the games they play have FSR support in them. Because guess what? FSR also works on GeForce GPUs. If there's all this negativity constantly swirling around any time an AMD-sponsored game is announced because AMD doesn't play fair, that is not helping with their brand, and more sponsorships with the same terms aren't going to get people talking about AMD's good features. It's just going to lead to more criticism of their policies. And lastly, I think AMD just needs to improve their products. No one would be having this discussion if FSR was superior or equivalent to DLSS and worked on both Radeon and GeForce GPUs, but that's not the case. Improving their technology and offering compelling features for Radeon owners is the best way to compete, not through dodgy side deals. So anyway, that's it for this one. I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on this. I think at this point, most people will probably have come to the same conclusion about this. But as I said, we just wanted to get AMD's response, see what they were actually going to say, whether they were willing to clarify anything. But yeah, they're not willing to say anything at the moment. So yeah, it doesn't look great for them. Pretty dodgy stuff. So if you do appreciate our independent analysis and testing that we do on the channel, then please do consider supporting us via Patreon and Floatplane. Links to those are in the description below, where you'll be able to access some of our bonus stuff, monthly live streams. We've got BTS content. We've got our Discord community if you want to chat about all these sorts of things. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.